Well, it's 6 now, so I think we will commence. Welcome everyone to the Friends of Senate House Library Holden Lecture for 2020. It's great to see so many people here this evening. This is the first time that we've held the Holden Lecture online. Indeed, it's the first online event for the Friends of Senate House Library. But I know that we're set for an exciting evening, and it's a great pleasure to be able to introduce what is one of the library's flagship annual events. Just to introduce myself, for those of you who don't know me, I'm Andrew Nash. I'm the person whose name has been at the bottom of the email invitations that you've been receiving. I work in the Institute of English Studies in the University of London, and I am currently chair of the Friends of Senate House Library. Moving the Holden Lecture online has, of course, been necessitated by the pandemic, and it would have been wonderful to have been able to deliver the lecture in Senate House itself. But we see this evening as part of a new opportunity for the Friends, and an opportunity to widen access to our events by allowing attendees to join us from anywhere in the world and from what I hope is the comfort of your own homes. As ever, I'm hugely grateful to colleagues in the library itself and in the University of London's Development Office who have worked tirelessly over a long period of time to get us to this stage. Before moving on to introduce our speaker for this evening, I'd like to say a few words about recent developments and activities in Senate House Library. It's been a turbulent but exciting few months. Following the closure of library buildings in March, library staff had to adapt rapidly to a completely new environment and to switch most of the operations and delivery online. But the upheaval led to the discovery of new and positive ways of engaging with library users through the implementation of online services and in the promotion of the library's growing collection of e-resources. Since mid-July, some of the usual services and operations have resumed, including the click and collect service, which has been very well received by users, myself included. And from mid-September, we've seen the gradual reopening of reading room spaces, including the Special Collections Reading Room, which reopened at the beginning of this month. The library has also continued to engage with the public in meaningful ways through the online exhibition, Childhood in Dickensian London, and other activities. And in November, next month, it will be participating in the Being Human Festival with an array of exciting events built around the library's collections, including 2 events developed in association with the Institute of English Studies devoted to the Terry Pratchett archive, an in-conversation event with Neil Gaiman, Rihanna Pratchett and Rob Wilkins exploring Pratchett's magical mind and world, followed by a digital humanities workshop which will open up the Pratchett archive to the public. Finally, I'm delighted to announce that we were able once more to run the very successful Visiting Research Fellowship, funded jointly by Senate House Library and the Friends. Most of you will remember that last year was the first iteration of this successful fellowship. And this year we awarded the fellowship to Dr. Richard Ashby, who will be undertaking a project on Harley Granville Barker, Shakespeare and the First World War, using the Granville Barker collection in the library. And Dr. Ashby began his fellowship on the 12th of October, pandemic notwithstanding, and we very much look forward to learning more about his research at a lecture event that we hope to mount in early 2021. And I'd like to take this opportunity now to encourage anyone who is not currently signed up as a friend of the library to consider doing so. You can sign up for free. I'm about to post the link in the chat function. As I say, you can sign up for free. There's no money involved, although obviously donations are welcome. And even those further afield might wish to sign up to ensure that you're notified of future events, some of which, certainly for the foreseeable future, will be taking place online. So to turn now to this evening's event. The Charles Holden Lecture is held annually and traditionally focuses on an aspect of Senate House Library's unique collections. And this year, we're delighted to highlight a recently acquired collection bequeathed to the university by the late Jonathan Cutbill, one of the founders of Gaze the Word Bookshop, which, as I'm sure you know, has its premises in Bloomsbury, just around the corner from the university. The Haud Nominandum collection, as Cutbill liked it to be known, charts the development of LGBTQ+ history and rights from 1760 up to the present time. The collection is a legacy of over 30,000 volumes, many of them rare and unique, as well as pamphlets, periodicals, and historical newspapers, some dating back to the 18th century, ephemera, and other papers, which illustrate LGBTQ issues and document the oppression that people have faced over many centuries. And Justin Bengry, our speaker tonight, will be offering some more personal words about Jonathan Cutbill at the start of his talk. So I will just say here that as well as having a passion about justice, Jonathan Cutbill also had a passion about books. He carefully catalogued and described every item in his collection and created his own system to classify the material he collected for over 40 years. Senate House Library is very privileged to have been gifted this collection, which has enormous potential for research and teaching, as well as community and public engagement. And the library has already evolved plans to develop the collection and to make it available to the public as soon as circumstances permit its cataloguing and dissemination. Which brings me to this evening's speaker. And I can think of no better person to deliver this particular Holden lecture than Justin Bengry, who provided valuable academic advice in support of the acquisition of the Cutbill archive. Justin teaches at Goldsmiths College, where he directs the Centre for Queer History and convenes the MA in Queer History, the first degree of its kind in the world. As a historian of sexuality and capitalism, he has published widely on queer histories of the post-war period, and his forthcoming book, The Pink Pound, Capitalism and Homosexuality in 20th Century Britain, is eagerly anticipated. Justin is also strongly committed to public engagement with academic research. He's a member of the AHRC-funded project Queer Beyond London, which explores how differences in locality have affected the way sexualities have been understood and experienced since the 1960s. And he's also acted as historical advisor for the National Gallery and the Queer Britain Museum, and for television programs that have aired on the BBC and Channel 4. And in his talk today, Justin will be speaking about the histories of some of the texts that you will find in the collection under the title Bulgarian Tendencies, Stories from the Queer Library of Jonathan Cutbill. Justin has also kindly agreed to field any questions from the audience after the lecture. Questions or comments can be made using the chat function, which you will find at the very bottom of your screen. Please feel free to ask questions, but I am going to request that you ask questions or make comments after the lecture has finished, and we will have a system of absorbing these and moderating them, and hopefully there'll be 10 or 15 minutes available at the end of the evening to be able to air some of those questions. So I'm now going to hand over to Justin, and this little exercise will happen miraculously because of the wonderful Becca who is hovering in the background.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction, Andrew. And also I want to thank Holly Peterson and Becca Simpson for all their help in rescheduling and reimagining this now online talk. I particularly want to thank Senate House Library for the honor of inviting me to deliver this year's Holden Lecture. This talk was originally scheduled just a few months after the transfer of Jonathan Cutbill's 30,000 plus piece LGBTQ plus library from his home in Shropshire to the University of London. We saw it as the first opportunity to acknowledge his generosity and to celebrate the amazing library he had amassed over a lifetime. By way of introduction to the talk, I'd like to expand on comments that were read on my behalf at Jonathan Cutbill's celebration of life in June 2019. I knew of Jonathan Cutbill long before I met the man. As the author of an important preface to the rediscovered World War I novel, Despised and Rejected, about the trials of a gay pacifist in the Great War, Jonathan entered my life and research more than a decade ago. But I didn't know then that he was also the co-founder of the iconic bookshop Gaze the Word, where I had, 10 years earlier still, mustered up the courage after walking back and forth, over and over, up and down Marchmont Street, London, to buy my first gay book, E.M. Forster's Morris. So, you see, by the time we finally met in person in 2017, Jonathan had already been having an impact on my life for some 20 years. But Jonathan Cutbill's gay activism and collecting extended back much further. Taking a PhD in geology at Cambridge in 1965, he worked at the Sedgwick Museum into the 1970s, where he was known even then to colleagues as an out gay man and vocal proponent of gay rights. Moving on to the National Maritime Museum, he was responsible for computerizing their collections. It was around this time in the mid-1970s, when they were both living in Blackheath, that gay liberationist Jeff Hardy, who remained Jonathan's lifelong friend, recalls seeing him for the first time. Resplendent in hennaed hair, Jonathan was holding another man's hand as they walked stridently across Blackheath Common through a military tattoo display. Jeff knew he needed to meet this brave man. Jonathan later relayed mischievously to him that he knew from his own military service that they were safe. Those disciplined men would not break rank. Jonathan Cutbill was a member of the support group at Gay Icebreakers in the 1970s, and with two others founded Gay's the Word in 1979. 5 years later, it was raided by Customs and Excise. Jonathan was among those threatened with imprisonment for conspiring to import and sell indecent or obscene literature. The charges were dropped 2 years later, but not before Jonathan had steadfastly refused to back down. Some of you might recall Senate House Library's own exhibition, Queer Between the Covers, that explored more than 2 centuries of queer literature in its collections. It included many of the same titles that were seized at Gay's the Word, apparently deemed by the authorities nowhere near so dangerous or obscene if safely stowed away on university shelves. I have no doubt that most are likewise preserved in Jonathan's personal collection. Jonathan has given us his library, his stories, his life's work. Current Gay's the Word manager Jim McSweeney recalls that, quote, for over 20 years, he bought a copy of every LGBT book that the bookshop stocked, adding them to his already extensive library. This is possibly the most important LGBTQ library in the country. It is undoubtedly of international significance, a fact well known to Jonathan. In one of my visits to Shrewsbury, he told me about researchers who came from abroad to consult books and materials unavailable elsewhere in libraries and archives. Now it will be housed at Senate House Library, where it can continue to be used by students, scholars, activists, and community members far beyond Bloomsbury. It was through Jeff Hardy that I was introduced to Jonathan, and in 2018, I had the great privilege of sitting with Jeff and Jonathan across 2 days as we recorded Jonathan's life story. It is harrowing to give something so personal and so intimate as your own story. It was the first time that Jonathan had ever shared some of these parts of himself, and in declining health, he also knew it would be the last. Surrounded by thousands of books and stories, the gift of his own story was a profound and moving experience. Jonathan died in May 2019, and his memorial stone was placed this last week. It honors his activism, and we believe this historic memorial is the first in the UK to celebrate someone's sexuality and gay liberation politics. And so Jonathan's activism continues. I'm honored to have known Jonathan in the last 2 years of his life, and in some way to have felt his influence for some 20 years. It is from amongst the many thousands of books and stories that surrounded us that day during our interview in Jonathan Cutbill's library that I draw 3 for this talk. Edward Carpenter found it virtually impossible to publish his writings on love and desire in the wake of the 1895 trials of Oscar Wilde. After Wilde's arrest, remembered Carpenter, quote, a sheer panic prevailed over all questions of sex, and especially, of course, questions of the intermediate sex. Contracted by his publisher T. Fisher Unwin in June 1895 for the collection of essays Love's Coming of Age, by August, Unwin had canceled Carpenter's contracts for this and the unrelated volume Towards Democracy when he heard about the author's Homogenic Love pamphlet. Despite being limited to private circulation, the publisher feared that Homogenic Love compromised both Carpenter's past work and future writings. Quote, under the circumstances, insisted Unwin, I desire to sever my connection entirely from them. In the end, Carpenter published the book himself at Manchester's Labour Press in 1896. Homogenic Love, described by historian Sheila Rowbotham as, quote, the first British statement by a homosexual man linking emancipation to social transformation, remained virtually unpublishable for another decade. Carpenter's writings advocating tolerance and even reform ultimately achieved wider publication and even commercial success. Published again in 1902, Love's Coming of Age ran to 12 editions by 1923. Later editions even included the essay, The Intermediate Sex. Expanded to a book-length collection that elaborated Carpenter's thoughts on same-sex relations, The Intermediate Sex was also initially difficult to publish, but eventually appeared in 1908. It included The Homogenic Attachment, a reworked version of his Homogenic Love essay, now published widely for the first time. It too went through a run of editions over several decades with publisher George Allen and Unwin. In the wake of the 1895 Wilde trials, T. Fisher Unwin saw only the dangers of publishing writings on gender and sexuality. By 1914, his nephew, Stanley Unwin, now operating George Allen and Unwin, recognized both the social merit in Carpenter's writings and also the potential remuneration. But the younger Unwin soon experienced what his step-uncle had feared. On the 8th of December 1915, Stanley Unwin received an inspector from Scotland Yard following complaints against The Intermediate Sex. Officials found the book, quote, indecent and unfit for general publication. On the basis of its particular nature, and quote, the wishes of the assistant commissioner, the officer asked if the publisher was prepared to withdraw the book. Unwin diffused the situation, noting the book's commercial success over the previous 7 years. It had been published by 2 other firms and was in its 3rd edition. Its success was its alibi. One of the earliest commercial enterprises that demonstrates awareness of both the commercial opportunity and also the danger of homosexuality is publishing. Some publishers recognize the potential sales opportunities afforded by appealing to readers drawn to themes that they could relate to in their own lives and desires. But publishers also knew that readers might buy these books for other reasons as well. Some consumers sought titles matching their own progressive and reformist politics. Others, regardless of sexuality, were titillated by discussions of forbidden desires. Still more appeared in the wake of trials or scandals that erupted in the press. Of course, there were also risks to printing these books. Critics condemned publishers in the press for courting homosexual markets or appealing to what they saw as the morbid curiosities of an impressionable public. The threat of prosecution also loomed large for publishers and sellers of books that might be convicted of being obscene. Under mid-Victorian legislation in place until the 1950s, it was difficult for them to defend themselves against accusations of a book's immorality or tendency to corrupt. Authors were even barred from giving evidence about their own books. Substantial fines and the loss of revenues from confiscated and destroyed stock further threatened anyone who risked publishing obscene materials. 3 case studies from Jonathan Cutbill's important library illuminate the competing promise of profit and the threat of prosecution that characterized pre-World War II publishers' relationship with homosexuality. Edward Carpenter struggled to find a publisher, but eventually achieved widespread success for both himself and Stanley Unwin, with only minor altercations with the authorities. Rose Aletini's book, The Ishmaelites, a sympathetic account of both pacifism and homosexuality, went through numerous evaluations before C.W. Daniel brought it to print in 1918. But prosecution of her novel nearly destroyed her publisher and ensured that the book would remain suppressed for much of the 20th century. Radcliffe Hall's infamous lesbian novel, The Well of Loneliness, was similarly prosecuted, but it became a bestseller on account of the scandal and publicity drummed up by both publisher Jonathan Cape and the press who vilified it. While the writings of Edward Carpenter, Rose Aletini, and Radcliffe Hall have all been scrutinized by historians at considerable length, I contend that their books' relationships to the marketplace, their publishers' motivations and relationships with the subject of homosexuality, and the complex negotiations and business strategies inherent in book production have only received passing note by scholars who've been more interested in literary analysis, biographical study, and the construction of individual or collective queer identities. Taken together, however, these 3 books illuminate how publishers and critics alike imagined and targeted homosexual consumers, how business enterprise mingled with politics, and how the scandal and titillation of queer desires helped build sales at a remarkably early moment in the history of the Pink Pound. So, Publisher Stanley Unwin's access to a queer market came unexpectedly. He had, in his words, inherited Edward Carpenter when he purchased the publisher George Allen and Company in 1914. Unwin handled all of Carpenter's subsequent publications, strategically using one book to sell others and listing them all together to build up sales. The books, including both Carpenter's political and sexual writings, provided Unwin with sufficient remuneration to keep them in print. He even sold rights for foreign markets. Carpenter's writings, however, remained relatively anomalous, and it continued to be difficult to publish material on homosexuality outside of limited legal and medical texts. And fiction generally fared worse unless references were carefully coded and veiled to avoid detection by officials. Some fiction authors did, however, still bring their work to publishers, even in the first decades of the 20th century. Edward Carpenter's acquaintance and fellow Allen and Unwin author Rose Aletini approached her publisher in 1917 with a new manuscript titled The Ishmaelites. The novel followed the life of Dennis Blackwood, a homosexual pacifist musician who struggled to find love and fulfillment in wartime Britain. A sharp indictment of the state's victimization, both of pacifists and homosexuals, the novel was particularly problematic in the context of World War I. There was little agreement at Allen Unwin as to how to proceed, but Stanley Unwin himself was unambiguous about his criteria for publishing. Quote, "The sole criterion must be whether or not the undertaking would pay its way." But Unwin worried that Aletini's book would instigate an expensive prosecution, particularly given its wartime promotion of pacifism. Before moving forward, he therefore sought reports from readers Bernard Miall, a translator and author, and Edward Skinner, another company director. In his 22nd of August 1917 report, Miall expressed concerns about publishing Aletini's manuscript despite its strengths. "I must confess," he began, "that my chief feelings after reading this very interesting and able piece of work are regretful." Miall had little hope that the Ishmaelites could avoid prosecution, since both pacifism as well as homosexuality remained under official ban. Quote, "What would happen to a book which seems to defend and even recommend the unpardonable sin of perversion?" he asked. In the end, however, Miall was not completely put off, believing even in World War I Britain that homosexuality was, quote, "doubtless a perfectly legitimate subject." Miall nonetheless asked if Unwin would be prepared for a prosecution, because the Ishmaelites was, he concluded, too good to lose if you can publish it. Pragmatically, Miall recognized that the potentially lucrative opportunity afforded by pairing two such controversial subjects, noting strategically, quote, "If it escapes all the censorships, its subject is bound to ensure a certain sale." Unwin continued to seek feedback through the autumn. Unlike Miall, Edward Skinner was concerned only with the threat of prosecution. 2 months after Miall's mixed report, Skinner was unequivocal. "If in a moment of madness you were to publish it, you would most certainly find yourself in Bow Street. Pray, therefore, return it hastily, lest worse befall you." Around the same time, Allen and Unwin was offered Mary Stopes' Married Love, a book in which Unwin immediately recognized exciting, quote, "sales possibilities." Aletini's contact at the publishing house, director Cecil Reynolds, supported her so stubbornly, however, that he refused to agree to publish Married Love if Unwin did not also agree to printing The Ishmaelites. And since both directors' signatures were required on author contracts, each effectively had a veto over any publication. Despite already being an advocate of Edward Carpenter, Unwin could not agree to Reynolds' terms. Marriage, he argued, was, quote, "a legitimate and normal thing, whereas homosexuality was illegal and a perversion." Aletini's book, Unwin thought, would surely instigate a prosecution. In the end, Unwin's decision was also financially motivated. After being assured that Aletini would return to Allen and Unwin in the future, he chose not to publish her novel. He then forwarded the manuscript to pacifist publisher C.W. Daniel, who published the book pseudonymously as by A.T. Fitzroy in May 1918 under the new title Despised and Rejected. It surely surprised few at Allen and Unwin when the book was charged and tried for offenses under the Defense of the Realm Act and almost immediately suppressed. Married Love, however, soon sold more than 1 million copies for someone else. The fate of Despised and Rejected may have given publishers pause when considering queer fiction, but it never ended their production completely. 10 years later, for example, Radcliffe Hall was never ambiguous about the well of loneliness. Defending the book in Reynolds Illustrated News in 1928, Hall declared herself, quote, "proud indeed to have taken up my pen in defense of those who are utterly defenseless, who being from birth a people set apart in accordance with some hidden scheme of nature, need all the help that society can give them." James Douglas of the Sunday Express was incensed, or at least put on a good show of it in print. He famously pronounced that he would, quote, "rather give a healthy boy or a healthy girl a vial of prussic acid than this novel. Poison kills the body, but moral poison kills the soul." He called on the Home Secretary to direct the Director of Public Prosecutions to take action to prevent any further circulation of the book. Interest in Hall's book had appeared even before Douglas's tirade, however. At publisher Jonathan Cape's Bedford Square offices, staff couldn't keep up with orders. According to one of Cape's clerks, they all wanted copies, 1s, 2s, 6s, 10s, 25s, 50s, and in the case of Bumpus, 100. The book's initial print run of 1,500 copies soon sold out. Even before the Sunday Express's condemnation, there were concerns that not all booksellers' orders could be met. Cape ordered a second printing to double in size. At Hatchard's of Piccadilly, senior partner Edwin Shepherd ordered 25 copies in July. Over the next month, he ordered another 262. The book sold so quickly, in fact, that when criticism of the book appeared, Hatchard's stock was already exhausted. Forestalling an official ban after the Sunday Express article, Cape announced his decision in the Times on the 23rd of August to suspend the book's production. By October, however, authorities noted, quote, "a very large number of printed circulars appearing from Paris, advertising the book's availability to British readers." Advertised, quote, "without the alteration of so much as a comma from the original London edition, customers were advised to send 25 shillings plus 11 pence postage to the Pegasus Press, Paris." Cape was ensuring continued revenues by having the book printed in Paris and then shipped back. Publishers Stanley Unwin, C.W. Daniel, and Jonathan Cape each recognized that Carpenter, Aletini, and Hall's books would appeal to several markets. But this appeal also brought criticism, in no small part because of the deliberate or perceived mingling of queer desires and desire for profits. Critics and state officials alike condemned not only the book's contents, but also, significantly, the financial motives they attributed to unscrupulous authors and publishers. Not surprisingly, Carpenter's The Intermediate Sex was met with mixed reviews. The Medical Times and Journal of Education both found the book a timely discussion of a neglected subject, assuring any concerned readers that there was, quote, "nothing nasty here," adding that one, quote, "cannot do better than read Edward Carpenter's little book." Praise for the book was not universal, however. The sarcastic tone of the British Medical Journal's 1909 review was established immediately upon its opening epigram. Derived from Lewis Carroll's The Walrus and the Carpenter, the journal's poem offered in place of the walrus an Urning in conversation with the Carpenter. The Urning and the Carpenter were sitting hand in hand. They wept because homogeny is generally banned. If prejudice were swept away, they said, it would be grand. If to abnormal practices we publicly adhere, do you suppose the Urning side the law might interfere? I doubt it, cried the Carpenter, and shed a sterile tear. Explaining the German term Urning, used to denote homosexual men, the article continued, quote, "To avoid any confusion, we may here remind our readers that the word urinal comes from a different root." The review concluded by calling the book ridiculous, hoping that, quote, "serious people in England might be spared the waste of time consumed in reading a low-priced book of no scientific or literary merit." Besides its content, the book's price and availability inflamed the reader. The reviewer linked sex and economics further, concluding, quote, "The author has definitely unbuttoned himself to anyone who likes to pay 3 shillings sixpence for this book." The reviewer's interest in the book's price is telling. Its low price could make the book accessible to a larger reading public than other higher-priced specialist legal and medical texts. It could also make the book a profitable venture. A few years later, Stanley Unwin's 1915 encounter with Scotland Yard over the intermediate sex had not actually ended with his clever rejoinder that I described above. Scotland Yard still hoped to see the book quietly withdrawn. Layered on top of that request was the implied threat of a potentially costly action. Because the entire stock of the book and its copyright was, in fact, Carpenter's property, as Unwin reminded him, it was for Carpenter to decide whether he was prepared to meet the costs of defending a prosecution. Carpenter instructed Unwin to delay, believing that the authorities would probably give way in the matter. He still hoped that the book's history, endorsements, and changing social norms would eventually sway Scotland Yard. But he was also prepared to use authorities' own prejudices and their implied threat of action against them. "Stick it out a bit," Carpenter instructed Unwin, adding cannily, "and point out that a prosecution would spread the subject more than ever." Were officials not to abandon their threats, as a last resort, Carpenter hoped that they would give way if the book's distribution and sales were limited by being sold only under medical or magisterial endorsement. But this deliberate undermining of sales was, quote, "a last resource" in Carpenter and Unwin's fight against Scotland Yard. When Stanley Unwin met with the assistant commissioner, he communicated no intention of withdrawing the book, even under threat of prosecution. Once again, identifying market forces, Unwin further expressed his undiminished intention to reprint the book, citing Carpenter's worldwide reputation and the constant demand for his books. Having pushed back against the authorities, Unwin discovered that despite the assistant commissioner's own misgivings about the book, he did not wish to dedicate resources to pursuing a case. Rose Aletini's new publisher would not be so fortunate in his encounter with authorities. Charged under the Defence of the Realm Act, Despised and Rejected's trial at Mansion House, London on the 10th of October 1918 nearly destroyed C.W. Daniel. Sir Charles Wakefield found the book, quote, "likely to prejudice the recruiting of persons to serve in His Majesty's forces and their training and discipline." For this offence, and for the 234 copies that remained in their possession, Wakefield assessed fines and costs against C.W. Daniel Limited and Charles Daniel personally in the devastating amount of £460, more than £30,000 today. Daniel was given 28 days to collect the fine or face 70 days in prison. While the book's promotion of pacifism was the immediate charge against Despised and Rejected, almost everyone agreed that its homosexual themes played a significant role in the verdict. In his summing up, Wakefield made clear that while the book was not appearing before him on obscenity charges, he nonetheless found it to be, quote, "a morally unhealthy and most pernicious book." Suggesting a market segment interested in homosexuality and profit to be derived from it, Wakefield concluded that the book, quote, "had been written in such a manner as to attract a certain class of reader for the personal profit of the publishers." While Unwin had been advised exactly this course of action, Daniel claimed no such awareness of any such immorality or desire to benefit from it. Extensive press coverage likewise highlighted the book's homosexual themes. Daniel soon issued a denial, identifying himself as a pacifist whose publications were above moral reproach. He was certain that the book had not promoted immorality. Further, he had, quote, "been assured by the author that the love between the hero and his friend was analogous to that between the biblical David and Jonathan." Perhaps Aletini knew better than Daniel the already well-established coded associations of David and Jonathan's friendship. Her acquaintance, Edward Carpenter, had used this same couple to illustrate a long history of same-sex desire in his own book, Ioleos, an Anthology of Friendship, a text that was already known to booksellers as the Bugger's Bible. But there was still the fine. Finding the outcry on the subject of homosexuality, quote, "vulgar and middle class," Ernest Arthur George Pomeroy, 7th Viscount Harberton, one of Daniel's other authors, had a suggestion. He pragmatically recognized the value of homosexuality to promote sales and suggested that publicity from the trial be used as an advertisement. It was, he reminded Daniel, crucial to promote the book through whatever means possible to raise funds for the fine. Harberton had no problem with homosexual acts, seeing, quote, no harm in rogering whatever you want to. It's quite natural, and dogs are not the least bit particular, nor are the Turks. Recognizing several overlapping markets, Harberton continued, the fact of the book possessing Bulgarian tendencies is, to this extent, an advantage, for curiosity draws countless readers to read it, apart from the actual Bulgarians themselves. Harberton is not talking about Southern Europeans. Referring to homosexuals as Bulgarians, an allusion to the word bugger, Harberton imagined already in 1918 a queer market that might be useful to Daniel. And besides this early reference to queer consumers, Harberton imagined countless other readers drawn by curiosity and titillation to buy the book as well. Rather than something to avoid, the book's queerness, steadfastly denied at trial, was according to Harberton both a fact and an advantage. For his part, Daniel was less optimistic. The police had confiscated his stocks and forbade reissue. Despite Harberton's suggestions, Daniel failed to capitalize on either the momentum of the trial publicity or build interest in sales for Despised and Rejected. The book was not printed again until 1975 and did not gain widespread attention until a gay men's press edition in 1988, seven decades after it first appeared, an edition which included a preface by Jonathan Cutbill. But the failure of Despised and Rejected was not the only possible scenario following the suppression of a book that dealt with homosexuality. A book's success could be assured by the scandal surrounding its suppression. When Radcliffe Hall's The Well of Loneliness came to trial on the 9th of November 1928 on charges of obscenity, publisher Jonathan Cape's defense was barred from calling expert witnesses, including Hall. Economic arguments therefore played an important role in the book's defense, but these took multiple, even contradictory forms. Defending the book's printing in France after being banned, the defense relied unabashedly on market interests, asserting, quote, there are large markets for books in the English language in other parts of the world and where the authority of the Home Secretary does not run. Rather than a location from which to print contraband copies, Paris, the defense claimed, was the base for accessing lucrative international markets outside the jurisdiction of British bans. Messrs. Jonathan Cape Limited are a business firm, the defense continued, and they have the English language rights in The Well of Loneliness in their own interests, and those of the author are entitled to these extraterritorial rights. It was only, quote, incidental that the Pegasus Press sought to import copies to the UK. Cape and his defense were careful, however, to distance him from blatant drives for profit and needed to diminish suggestions linking economic incentives and lesbianism. It was a fine balance, as Cape needed to appeal to the liberal values of free enterprise without appearing exploitative or worse, immoral himself. The defense used the book's price and motivation to support this strategy. Priced originally at 15 shillings, twice as much as most other novels, they claimed the price, quote, would keep the book out of the hands of the young and those for whom it was not intended, restricting it instead to, quote, the more thoughtful and serious type of reader. Edward Carpenter had been damned for the low price and therefore the availability of his affordable book 2 decades earlier, and by inference, the income it might generate. Betraying the same concerns, Cape's defense argued that it was in fact The Well of Loneliness's higher price that made it less accessible and therefore less dangerous, presumably showing Cape less motivated by profit. The defense further countered the book was, quote, not to be regarded purely as entertainment. Indeed, the book was, quote, being widely used today for the communication of knowledge. The Well of Loneliness had, they argued, higher goals than crass profits. But it was precisely for this, what the chief magistrate described instead as, quote, a passionate and almost hysterical plea for the tolerance and understanding of these people, that he found the book an obscene libel. He ordered copies destroyed and fined defendants Jonathan Cape and Leopold Hill each 20 guineas costs. The scandal and trial, however, expanded sales figures beyond anything yet seen. Hall's partner remembers finding the book well known and widely available in Paris when they relocated there after the trial. Soon, demand was so high that Shakespeare and Company, the famous Parisian bookshop, couldn't keep it in stock. Only a month after Douglas's condemnation, contracts for both German and Dutch rights had been signed. And less than 2 weeks after being condemned in the UK, the contract for US rights was finalized. The Well of Loneliness's international success only expanded in the aftermath of the trial, with further contracts throughout 1929 for rights in Norwegian, Danish, and French in May, Italian in July, Czech in August. Further foreign language rights, including Polish 1930 and Swedish 1932. Most important and lucrative of all, however, was the American market. After being cleared at trial there in 1929 for violating any law, cheap editions were authorized in 1930 and again in 1932 and 1936. It became a worldwide success, translated into 11 languages and selling more than 1 million copies by 1945. I'd like to use one final anecdote to conclude this talk. During the summer of 1933, a certain William Fudge contacted the Daily Mail's Montague Smith with a confidential proposition. Fudge's firm, the Mitre Press, had just published a novel which Fudge described as being, quote, of the same type as Radcliffe Hall's The Well of Loneliness and Sheila Donisthorpe's Loveliest of Friends, another book that explored lesbian themes, a beautiful edition of which is also in the Cutbill Library. Fudge never named the novel, but assured Smith that review copies had not yet been forwarded to readers or critics. He offered the journalist, quote, the opportunity to write an attack on the novel in the Daily Mail, where he could take credit for discovering an objectionable book. By this time, the enormous success of The Well of Loneliness, followed by its condemnation in the Sunday Express, was clear. The Loveliest of Friends, Fudge added, had similarly benefited after being denounced in the press. Published in 1931 by a firm later purchased by the Mitre Press, the book enjoyed, quote, tremendous sales following a leader page 3 columns attack on it in the Sunday Chronicle. Quote, if you would agree to write a bitter attack on our book, Fudge proposed, and to have in it a prominent place in your paper, then he would guarantee Smith a scoop over any competitors. Fudge made clear, however, that Smith's attack must demand that the book be banned. He then guaranteed Smith indemnity against any action by the publisher, quote, however bitter and violent the attack on the book. Smith never wrote the attack, choosing instead to contact the authorities. The case was brought to the attention of the Home Office, but after the success of The Well of Loneliness following its obscenity trial, officials were reluctant to move forward. The office had, in fact, elected not to pursue charges against The Loveliest of Friends, after which officials heard very little of the book. Further, since no copies of the Mitre Press book had yet been released, it was impossible to determine if the book was actually obscene. If it were blatantly indecent, commented one official, it would get plenty of advertisement even without Fudge's scheme. The director of public prosecutions was mindful of how a high-profile obscenity prosecution could now be part of a publisher's deliberate strategy to promote sales, adding that, quote, this throws a somewhat distinctive light on the attitudes of publishers of this kind towards official action. By the early 1930s, it was clear that publishing dangerous queer books could actually offer significant returns. It was clear offer significant returns, and that the strategic risk of press attacks or even prosecution could be balanced against the publicity they offered. The Mitre Press's strategy was clear to all. Publishers need the books they print to offer returns. This does not necessarily diminish their commitment to political or social values, but considering their publication decisions as informed by losses and profits forces us to evaluate early 20th century writings on homosexuality differently. Stanley Unwin believed unreservedly in the importance of Edward Carpenter's books, but advised of the threat of prosecution for printing the Ishmaelites chose to avoid the dangers of publishing fiction that overtly discussed homosexuality. Charles Daniel, committed to the cause of pacifism and only perhaps influenced by the drive to reap profits from the scandal that others had recognized in the book, paid dearly for his decision to publish Despised and Rejected. Only a decade later, Jonathan Cape, Radcliffe Hall, and the Sunday Express all profited handsomely from the scandal associated with Hall's novel, The Well of Loneliness. These stories drawn from the library of Jonathan Cutbill relate the challenges encountered by publishers who, even in the first decades of the 20th century, openly printed queer books. But they also identify the potential market for materials that promoted tolerance, understanding, and even advocated legal reform. Mainstream publishers like Stanley Unwin and Jonathan Cape in particular, but C.W. Daniel as well, were all committed to appealing to multiple audiences, but none was underground or marginal. Their decision to publish these, however, would bring them into conflict with authorities and critics concerned with regulating public discussion of homosexuality, particularly when it overlapped with commercial incentives and the possibility of profit. An examination of the pre-World War II publishing industry neatly encapsulates the competing forces of profit and danger and demonstrates a kind of pink economy even from the very beginning of the 20th century. Thank you.
Justin, thank you so much. It is, of course, the major drawback of online lectures that we can't hear that thunderous applause that would have accompanied the end of your lecture. As I mentioned at the beginning, Justin is very happy to take questions or comments, and we would like to take these via the chat function. If you navigate your way to the bottom of your screen, you'll find that the chat button is in the middle of the bottom panel of the screen. So please feel free to pose a question or make a comment. Whilst people are doing that, I'd like to open up, Justin, if I may, by asking a question of my own, which is founded on a rather simplistic proposition, which is that you began by saying that Edward Carpenter's book was published in the immediate wake of the Wilde trial. You also mentioned the point that Aletini's book was published in 1918 and that the authority that was invoked against it was the Defence of the Realm Act. So we can see that these two significant glaring contexts of the Wilde trial and the First World War and the national effort of the First World War are very easy to mount these as important and significant contexts. In light of that, what was it about the late 1920s? Was there anything particular about that period that might have accounted for, in part, the reaction that was taken to The Well of Loneliness? Or was it just James Douglas reacting in his characteristic way, a similar way to how he had reacted to D.H. Lawrence's The Rainbow, for example?
Well, interestingly, from what I understand, Douglas's condemnation was out of step with a lot of the other discussion that was going on in the press in response to The Well of Loneliness. A variety of papers ranging from the national press to local papers were discussing The Well of Loneliness, and reviewers were identifying the book as bringing out a topic that needed some airing and was certainly a worthwhile topic in that day and age. And certainly questions around gender presentation and sexuality were increasingly coming into public discourse in the 1920s, and not just entirely in elite discourse either. The criticisms that were leveled against the book by other reviewers were sometimes that Hall was clearly too close to her subject, and that they needed someone that had greater objectivity to appropriately deal with such an important issue. So one criticism, rather than the book was obscene, was that it needed objective airing and discussion. Another was some reviewers didn't necessarily find that Hall's writing was up to snuff, and didn't necessarily enjoy it aesthetically, and the criticism was more on its literary merits rather than the topic. So it does seem that the condemnation in the tabloid played an incredible role in driving forward action against the book. But also it's worth noting that the condemnation in the Express was itself commercially motivated. I didn't have space in this paper to go into discussion, extensive discussion of that, and it's not my own original research. Certainly Laura Doan and others have identified Douglas's strategic motivations in drumming up his own circulation figures in what was called the August silly season for the press. So that my allusion to Douglas putting up at least a good show of being angry about the book was referring to that. Though we have other examples of Douglas in the same condemnatory attitude in other articles across decades. So not entirely out of character either, but motivated by more than, say, homophobia.
Yeah. We've had a couple of comments and one question in the chat section. The words excellent and fascinating have emerged. There's a question specifically about your references to queer market and the queer consumer. The question is whether you've come across evidence of publishers' attempt to market directly to a queer market, or any evidence of queer consumers who purchased or more tenuously read these titles. I think it's a question then really about how we might go about defining a queer market, or how we go about defining queer consumers. Did publishers have a sense of that? Did they have a sense of a particular market of readers, and also how they might reach those readers?
I think in this period they were grappling with what that meant. I think they were recognizing that there were people whom they could identify as different because of gender presentation, sexual interest. I don't know that they necessarily lumped them together in the way that we would coordinate them today, nor would they have necessarily identified themselves as sharing a common interest. I mean, this gets to a really interesting question about market forces identifying a group of people that could be useful to them, and whether they actually have a subcultural identity or commonality identified amongst themselves. That's one of the key questions of the project I'm working on, is to navigate that conundrum, because I think there's something very interesting about capitalistic forces identifying a group of people who do not yet identify themselves necessarily as having something in common, and yet they're being recognized as having some kind of interest that draws them to books on this subject, at the same time that commentators of all sorts are recognizing in the urban environment, in society of the day, individuals who are sexually different. So there's a number of factors that are coming into play that are being coordinated in some way by these publishing houses. I don't have evidence of them explicitly saying, let's direct this to those people, but rather more the quotes that I was using here saying, we know that some of them will buy this. So it's not quite as organized as a kind of marketing strategy specifically to them. Also, where would they market them to, and how would they do that? They were grappling with all of these things. In terms of individuals who were buying the books, we do have really great examples of interviews and oral histories of people who later more clearly identified as queer. And I'm using the term queer deliberately to avoid nailing people down to gay or lesbian in a way that we understand today, but they may later have identified themselves, in that way. But we have oral histories of people that were reading these books and finding value in them, and finding stories that resonated with themselves at these times. And it's not just in book publishing. I'm finding the same things going on in magazine publishing. I've also worked on the early men's press from the late 18th century to the 1930s. So actually pretty much overlapping this same moment. And I don't have the editorial comments and behind the scenes business records to confirm exactly what was being thought by creators of the early men's press, but I do have the actual magazines themselves that are using very clearly coded knowledge that was only understood among a minority of people. So someone was getting the word out, and someone was knowing that someone else would receive it.
You've mentioned economics of publishing on more than one occasion, both in your talk and in your answer to that question, your very detailed answer to that question. It makes me think, of course, of the economics of authorship as well. And you mentioned that Edward Carpenter retained his copyright. And if I remember correctly, perhaps you can explain a little bit more about this. Many of his books were published on commission. So he wasn't necessarily, he didn't have an investment in the sales to quite the same extent, or at least he didn't allow his publishers to have an investment in the sales to quite the same extent as Jonathan Cape was invested in the sales of The Well of Loneliness. Was that in any way connected to Carpenter's political beliefs? Was it? Do you see it as a way of sort of overcoming the commercialization of the marketplace, and is that connected in any way to the queerness and the expression of homosexuality which is contained within the book?
That's a really interesting proposition, and actually one of the reasons why I love having the opportunity to give a talk and to air these ideas, because that's not something that I've explored. But I think there's a lot of merit in that idea. I haven't gone into the detail of research into Carpenter's own holdings, his own positions as strongly as I have the correspondence with Unwin's offices and what Unwin was doing with his books. So I mean, honestly, what I'd say is you're giving me an avenue of further exploration. So I think that's a really exciting proposition, and one that intuitively makes a lot of sense to me. I think there's an argument to be made there. And as I'm revising this, I will footnote you on that.
Okay. There's a question which I think, if I'm interpreting it correctly, is attempting to suggest a link to the way in which the modern media handles gender pronouns. The question refers to talking of the attitudes towards the books that were mentioned and the similar attitudes that we see today with regards to gender pronouns by the BBC, by the Safe Schools Alliance today. Can you observe a link? Is there something that you can pick up in relation to that?
I don't fully understand the link that's being drawn to be able to comment on it with regard to gender pronouns. If I can see the comment written on the side, if Jeff right. could elaborate on that a bit more, I'd be happy to respond. And actually, I'm happy to acknowledge this is Jeff Hardy that I made reference to in the talk. So I'm delighted that Jeff can join us today. And Jeff was a dear friend of Jonathan Cutbill's and is responsible for introducing me to Jonathan, and obviously played a huge role in the preservation of the library and its transfer to London. So Jeff is an appropriate and welcome guest tonight.
Okay, I've just asked my colleagues at Senate House Library if it's possible to allow Jeff to be put on to speak. Whilst we're determining whether that is possible, we have a couple of other questions that have come through. One concerning magazines. I mentioned right at the beginning that the Cutbill collection is particularly strong in periodicals and newspapers. This is perhaps a niche question, but I think there's a broader question to draw out of it, of whether physique magazines appear in the Cutbill collection, and whether Cutbill collected heavily in this area. Perhaps I might broaden that out a little bit to link it more towards your talk, which is certain publications that we might label as queer or engaging with queer issues, or possibly being appealing to a queer audience, however we might define that. might actually emanate from, to generalize, might emanate from other spaces. Physique magazines strike me as a particularly good example of that, something that would have an appeal to a wide constituency of readers for different reasons. I don't quite know how to sort of draw out that sort of broader question, but do you think in perhaps trying to link it to the connections you're drawing between publishers' pursuit of profit and publishers' threat of prosecution, might magazines and periodicals also be seen within that broad context?
Absolutely, 100%. And in fact, there's been, well, precious little work actually on physique magazines and other homoerotic publications in the UK, but in the American literature, it's extensive, and there's fantastic work by David Johnson that's come out on the physique magazines and publishers of physique publications there, and he makes the compelling and absolutely convincing argument that in the 50s and 60s, the reach of physique magazines, for gay men at least, was wider than the activist publications that we have tended to honor in historical research. And perhaps we've inflated the significance of activist publications when in fact physique magazines were circulating much more widely, and actually at the same time weren't just to use the phrase one-handed literature. They actually included a lot of other content. They engaged with censorship debates, and publishers of physique magazines in the States were among those that took the risk of prosecution, and even took those cases high enough to secure the right to transport homoerotic and homosexual publications across state lines. So in fact, it was those magazines that had both the promise of profit that offered them so much, but also the threat of danger that they had to navigate in their production. And together, these two forces actually drove forward a lot of political gains in the United States. I don't think that the same achievements happened here in the UK with physique publications, but it's an area that needs much further research, and I'm not aware of much that's been done by historians. So it's something that is, I think, directly parallel to what I've been writing about and talking about here tonight. I'd also add that one of the incredible benefits and value to be drawn from Jonathan Cutbill's collection is that it's not just high literature or middling literature or sexological literature or any of these elite or less elite types of publications, but in fact includes physique magazines, includes erotic and pornographic literature, includes everything you can imagine and probably a few things you can't. And I think it's precisely in that combination of high and low, and of just an absolutely voracious appetite for any kind of LGBTQ publication that Jonathan had, that makes that library so profoundly valuable and unique.
Thanks very much. It looks as if we have successfully managed to get Jeff onto the screen, and he's also, I think, successfully unmuted himself. There's a little bit of background noise, but perhaps I might invite Jeff to put a question if we can shed the background noise somehow.
Hi there. Yes. Sorry to confuse you, Justin. What I was thinking about was it's very easy to put history in the past and the prejudice in the past, and the ludicrous comments made by some people and some organizations. So when you were talking about Despised and Rejected and Carpenter and Radcliffe Hall, what sounds now to be so ludicrous in the sort of comments made at the time reminds me very much of sort of sex and relationship education in schools. And the BBC tweeted a cartoon of different people. It was a guy in a turban, somebody else, different kinds of young people. And underneath it simply had he, him, her, they, them, and other such very innocuous things. And these people were saying how dangerous this was, because this was, you know, propaganda going into schools and was going to influence children. It seems to me that it's the same damn stuff. And therefore what I was looking at was making that connection, which I think Jonathan would have made, between what was happening then and what's happening now. So it was really just throwing up a comment that occurred to me, and hello. How do I mute?
Yeah, hello, Jeff. Thank you for that. That makes more sense to me now. Thank you for expanding on that. Yeah, and I think actually the comparison to, you mentioned Carpenter, but it's I suppose specifically it's that mean-spirited review in the British Medical Journal. I mean, in the British Medical Journal, I didn't quite, that was a fascinating find. I didn't expect to find such a really quite itself just a mean-spirited, vicious review that was just, it was bullying. It was a bullying review basically in that take on the walrus and the carpenter. So certainly there is that kind of just mean-spiritedness that regrettably we see, that we continue to see today, even in some publications and some broadcasts that thinks it's funny but is mean-spirited. I think as a contrast to that, I've always been such a fan of the letter that I put up by Harburton, in which I didn't expect to find that in 1918, where it's basically live and let live. I mean, he literally says, like, I don't care if you're rogering whoever you want to. It makes no difference to me. It's not what I expected to find in 1918, that kind of, like I said, live and let live attitude. And then to say, make money off those Bulgarians. I mean, that letter is probably in 10 or 15 years of working on this topic, the most, I think it's the best find. It's my favorite find easily. I haul that out whenever I can to public talks.
Thanks very much. I'm glad we were able to address that question properly. We're coming towards the end of our time. We've already run over by a few minutes. There was one question, which perhaps I suppose was the obvious question, which is, do we have any sense of when Jonathan's collection will be accessible at the university? I was about to say I would love to be able to answer that question, but a colleague from Senate House Library has attempted to answer it by saying that the library has now received all 30,000 plus books from the Cutbill collection. And as soon as the current circumstances allow, cataloguing will begin so that we can make it searchable and accessible. So regrettably, given the current situation, the process obviously will be slower. And when you're dealing with a collection of some 30,000 items, and because they're not just books, that's also puts added difficulty into the equation. But everything seems to, the very fact that all the material has found its way across Bloomsbury to Senate House Library, or from Shrewsbury to Senate House Library, that is the absolute first step. So as soon as current circumstances allow and staff are able to work in the way in which they would normally work, cataloguing will begin. So I think the key thing is that we will keep everybody informed. You can follow Senate House Library on Twitter. You can sign up to be a friend of Senate House Library, which will allow you to have information and updates on what is going on in the library, and also information about our future events. And I've put the link up there again. But I think at this stage, I'm going to draw proceedings to a close, and I'm going to thank, first of all, everyone for attending and everyone who asked questions. I'm going to thank Justin greatly on behalf of all attendees for giving us such a wonderful lecture this evening. So much to think about. To thank my colleagues in Senate House Library and in the Development Office. And this has been an extremely entertaining evening, and I think we're all going to go away and eagerly await any announcement of the availability of the collection. So thank you all for coming, and I hope you have a pleasant evening.